Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all. Thank you very much for the warm welcome. John Bozeman heard what a tough crowd it was, so he told me that I was going to have to handle you all by myself this morning. It's always, first, great to be home during this Easter recess, and always great to be with the Farm Bureau. Much of our society, when it comes to the coasts, on the East Coast and the West Coast, make a living with their minds. They are TV producers or pundits that you see on television. They move money around, lawyers as well. Our society needs all those people. We need all types. But a society needs people that work with their hands as well. They need people who get their hands in their dirt. They need people that move around cattle and chickens and hogs and all the rest. And I've done both in my life. I grew up on a farm, as you heard. Still get out on the farm every now and then. Probably not as much as my father would like. Probably not as much as my mother would like in particular. Probably not, maybe especially as much as my father's friends would like whenever they have to go out and help him while I'm in Washington. I was in the Army, where, certainly as a commander of troops, I had to lay plans and I had to make operations orders for our soldiers. But I was right there beside them, working with my hands, carrying my pack, carrying my rifle, engaged in firefights and so forth. But I've also been a lawyer and I've been in business. So I've done a lot of different things. But there is no country, there is no society that can survive without people who are out in the fields and in the factories, working with their hands, building the products or making the food that helps feed a society. So I want to thank you all very much for what you do. Thank you for being the backbone of America here in Arkansas and for what you represent for all around the country. Now, I want to discuss just a few issues before we'll open up for question and answers about what's been going on in Washington as it might relate to some issues you care about. First, I want to talk about a bill I've worked on at some length, the GMO legislation that you might have heard about. The Senate took it up earlier this month. So as most of you know, genetically modified organisms have been a great boost for our agricultural economy as well as for consumers. Study after study after study have proven that GMO food is safe and it's affordable. One of the most anti-science positions you can take is that there's something dangerous with GMO food. All it does is drive up the cost of food, which hurts people who are struggling to make ends meet, who don't go to Whole Foods to buy their food, but buy their food at Walmart and Dardanelle. It hurts people all around the world who are trying to live on just a few dollars a day, maybe at most. It hurts you as producers by driving up your costs as well. In the House of Representatives 2 years ago, one of my closest friends in the Congress, Mike Pompeo from Kansas, and I worked together on his legislation to pass it through the House, died in the Senate. Last year it passed through the House again. We've been working for over a year to get it to the Senate floor. Unfortunately, just a couple weeks ago, it was voted down 49 to 48 because some on the far left have indulged in this kind of anti-science viewpoint that we need to mandate every single GMO product that's in food today. In fact, they are going to allow a single state, Vermont, smaller than a congressional district in Arkansas, to dictate national food labeling requirements. That's what this legislation would have done. It would have set a simple, single, voluntary standard that allowed people to market their food. If you want to market to people who are scared about GMO food, who are willing to pay more, who have the money to pay more, that's fine. You should do that. Put a label on your food. Make an ad campaign. Appeal to those people who have a little bit extra money that they can spend on your products. But don't force it on everyone else. Don't force the price of their grocery bill to go up here in Arkansas $55 a month, almost $700 a year, when your typical family makes barely $40,000 a year. That's a big hit. A single state like Vermont shouldn't be able to dictate those standards to what we do here in Arkansas, whether it's growing the food or whether it's eating the food. Nor should cities like Berkeley or Portland be able to do that. That's one of the reasons why we have a federal union. Oliver Wendell Holmes, a famous Supreme Court justice, said that the country could easily survive if the Supreme Court couldn't strike down a federal law, but we wouldn't survive if the Supreme Court can strike down state laws. Because states will regulate the economy in their own favor. And surprise, surprise, Ben & Jerry's receives favorable treatment under Vermont state law. That's why we need, at the federal level, a clear and simple voluntary standards that recognizes the promise of GMO food, but also allows people that want to avoid it to have the information they want and pay a little bit more without driving up costs for everyone else. Now, we're going to revisit this issue later this year, I hope, in the Senate, whether it's on spending legislation or whether it's on a revised version of this bill. And I'll be working on that bill and working on this issue for as long as it takes to get it right. But the clock is ticking. The Vermont rule goes into effect on July 1. I met with major food producers who have operations here in Arkansas and all around our country who are already saying they're having to change the way they process their foods, the way they generate the labels, the way they pack and ship that food, which is already going to contribute to higher costs on the grocery shelves of Americans, on the grocery shelves of Arkansans in just a couple months. Now, I mentioned the Supreme Court. I want to say a word about the Supreme Court and Justice Scalia's death, because I think it impacts us here in this room, just like it impacts every Arkansan. So as you know, Justice Scalia passed away last month. There won't be any replacement for Nino Scalia. He was irreplaceable. He's a great jurist, great American, great man. However, I don't think President Obama should make an appointment to this court when the American people have a chance to weigh in on that appointment in just a few months. I think the American people should have a say, not just in who controls the presidency, but in who controls the Congress and the Supreme Court. It's a very rare thing in our democracy. Normally, it's just one of those institutions up for grabs, maybe two, but this time the American people have a chance to make their say in who's going to control all three branches of our government. You have it here in Arkansas. We'll have a vote for president, we'll have a vote for Senate, and I hope you vote for John Bozeman. But why would we silence the voice of millions of Americans on an institution that has grown, in my opinion, increasingly, unfortunately, influential in the way we lead our lives? I think we can wait for a few months to let the Supreme Court make that decision. Why does that matter to you? Besides what the Supreme Court does for all of our lives, whether it's cases about religious liberty or union dues or abortion, to name just a few that have been up for grabs this term. Well, increasingly, a lot of the rules that affect your life come not from Congress, but they come from regulatory agencies like the EPA or Fish and Wildlife Services, which often get reviewed by the courts, first the Court of Appeals and then the Supreme Court. In fact, one of the farthest reaching regulations, in my opinion, one of the most overreaching regulations is this so-called Waters of the U.S. regulation. Most of you in this room know about it. You know that it would extend what is a legitimate federal operation or federal responsibility, overseeing the navigable waters of the United States, rivers like the Arkansas River or the Mississippi River, to every small tributary, every creek, every pond, sometimes every puddle. Would have vast implications, not just for farmers and ranchers, but your normal property owner who wants to build a home and maybe put in a swimming pool or move some dirt around, so forth. Well, that's been stayed by a court of appeal, so it's not going forward at this moment. And we don't know what the ultimate decision will be by that court or by the Supreme Court. But this election could have a decisive impact on what happens to that regulation, or to any other regulation or any other kind of administrative action that affects you in your livelihoods and your families and our communities. You probably know the Secretary of Agriculture just recently said that oilseed or cottonseed couldn't be included as an oilseed. Well, that's the kind of thing that often gets reviewed by the courts, and frequently all the way up to the Supreme Court. So who controls these courts truly matters in our lives. Matters too much, in my opinion. These regulatory agencies shouldn't be making so many decisions, and the court shouldn't have to review so many of them. That's why you elect people like me. And if you approve of the job we do, you can re-elect us in every 2 or 6 years. And if you don't, you can choose someone else. That's the system of democratic accountability we're supposed to have in our society. But as long as we have agencies like the EPA and like Fish and Wildlife Service and USDA that are making decisions that impact your livelihood and your families and your communities, we need courts that are going to follow the basic rule of law and apply even-handed justice in evaluating those regulations. Now, I was in Washington last week. Even though we were in recess, John and the 4 congressmen you heard from yesterday got to run around the state and enjoy themselves. We were there because we care so passionately about this matter. The Senate has the power to confirm Supreme Court justices. The President, however, under our Constitution, has the ability to make what's called a recess appointment. So if the Senate's not in recess or not in session to confirm a nominee, then the President can appoint someone to any office without Senate confirmation. This goes back to the early days of our republic, when you didn't have jets and you didn't have trains and you didn't have telephones, and the Senate might be out of session for months at a time. There's a recent court decision, though, that says any recess for 3 days or less, the President can't make a recess appointment. And we feel strongly enough, as our Senate Republican caucus, that we've just said to ourselves, we've said to Americans, we will make an extraordinary effort to stay in session every 3 days to stop the President from using his recess appointment power, to ensure that the American people get to have their say in just a few months. So I was there to gavel into a very brief session, and I mean very brief, about 45 seconds. The gallery laughed at me when I adjourned us. I told them that it wasn't much better on a normal day of session. But I was willing to take that time away from my family and away from my constituents and a beautiful spring here in Arkansas, because the court is just that important. Not just in kind of abstract, high-level issues that you sometimes read about in the newspaper, but in your day-to-day lives and your livelihood. Third and final, I want to talk about an issue I know that's been on your agenda here a lot, trade. Oftentimes, when you hear people talk about America's relationship with the world, farmers and ranchers in places like Arkansas or Iowa or Kansas are considered to be inward-looking, that they've never thought America should play a big role in the world. They think that we spend too much money trying to preserve global security and order. Actually, it's the exact opposite is true. If you go back and you read history books, if you actually look at newspapers from places like Arkansas, like Iowa, like Kansas, like Nebraska, from 100 or 150 years ago, you'll see that America's farmers and ranchers have always been outward-looking. They knew in the 19th century that changes in the value of the pound in London could have drastic effects on the price of their goods. That any kind of war, any kind of trade dispute could have drastic effects on where they could sell their products overseas. So it's actually the farmers and the ranchers who are in the heartland of America who for decades, going back to the 19th century, have been the backbone of America's role in the world. And trade doesn't just mean that you can buy less expensive socks or jackets at Walmart, that the price of electronics that have been selling in this country now for 10 or 15 years on the cutting edge of technology are that much cheaper. It means that you can find new markets for your products all around the world. It means that you can ship your goods. You can have price competition. And you can help feed the world places that can't grow what you grow or raise what you raise. Now, competition's not always fair. Unfortunately, in much of the world, what we call corruption, they call life. You know, there's been a dispute with the Iraqi Grain Board for a few years now. I was in Iraq in October with Senator McConnell and a few of my fellow freshmen. We met with the Prime Minister. I specifically mentioned this problem to him, that someone who fought in that country and who views it as a critical ally in the region, it's much tougher for me to make that case to Arkansans when Arkansan rice can't be sold there, even though it's higher quality and lower price than much of what the Grain Board was buying. He alluded to me that there was going to be news coming down the pike soon that would probably make me and a lot of my constituents back home happy, and in fact, that minister has since been charged with corruption and removed. That doesn't mean that the problem there is solved once and for all. It doesn't mean that every market is opened up for us. But it does mean that an active and engaged America in the world that is looking for new markets, looking to reduce trade barriers, looking to reduce tariffs, doesn't just mean a better deal for our consumers when they go shop at Walmart for their weekly goods or their household products. It also means new markets and new customers for all of you. It means that we can grow our agricultural economy here in Arkansas because we're not just feeding people in America, we're feeding people all around the world. And that's something in my work on the Armed Services Committee and the Intelligence Committee, besides doing things like making sure our military is funding, making sure our intelligence professionals have the tools they need, that I am constantly consulting with foreign ministers that come through Washington or ambassadors about. Food, as you know, is always very controversial in geopolitics. It's one of the first things that dictators like Kim Jong-un try to use against their own people. But countries around the world know that Arkansas is open for business when it comes to international trade, and they know that Tom Cotton both wants the United States to be their friend, but wants them to be the friend of Arkansas's farmers and ranchers. So those are just 3 items that have been on my mind as we've been in Washington over the last month or so since I got back for Easter that I wanted to share with you. Now I want to open it up for questions. We'll go through the questions and then we can reach the comments and insults after that. And when we open it up for questions here, I should say too, feel free to ask anything. I mean, you're here, the Farm Bureau Summit, and obviously we've got some questions about agricultural policy, I'm sure. But your moms and dads, your sons and daughters, you sit on local bank boards or hospital boards, university boards. So anything that's in the news or on your mind, it doesn't have to be about ag policy. Happy to take questions. Do we want to, Zach? Are we going to try to move a microphone around, or? Yeah, I got it.
Senator Mike Free, State Board Member. Congressman Westerman yesterday talked to us about his Healthy Forest Initiative that the House has passed and sent to the Senate, and it's not been taken up by the Senate. But the reason I bring it up was at the American Farm Bureau meeting, Secretary Vilsack told us that he would no longer take funds away from other Forest Service initiatives to try to pay for to fight the forest fires, that they've been catastrophic forest fires. And I was wondering your thoughts on that. He wants them to be declared, natural disasters and paid for in a different manner.
So, well, first let me just address the general point that you raised there at the end. A managed forest is a healthy forest. Forests need to be managed. The radical environmental left thinks that nature was pristine and peaceful before human beings came along. It's simply not the case. I mean, they did have fire 500 years ago in North America. It might have been started by lightning, and it might have caused, but it still caused forest fires. We have the technical and scientific means at our hands to help manage forests in a way that accommodate all the interests, whether it's timber and forestry products or recreational use or so forth, and do so in a responsible way. I would say that forest fires are more like a regular kind of routine operations and maintenance, and the prevention of them is, as opposed to a natural disaster like an earthquake, because they can be largely prevented with the right management techniques. Now, I think most people in Arkansas tend to agree with that viewpoint. In my experience, it's the people from the Pacific West that often share or often don't share it, that have a slightly more extreme view of what human beings should be doing in forests. Bruce's legislation, I hope, will come up in the Senate. The Senate, you may have heard, moves a little bit slower than the House does. Someone asked me what it was like to be a new dad, and I said, well, there's a lot of temper tantrums, some crying, nap time every day. It's not all that different from being in the Senate. But I do hope Bruce's legislation comes up. We've worked with his office on that. Maybe it won't come up by itself. Maybe it will come up as part of a larger bill, maybe a spending bill, something like that. But I do hope we can move that forward. He's obviously one of the subject matter experts in the Congress because of his background, and he's recognized as such already.
Thank you again for coming. You talked about being in Iraq and meeting with the grain board there. Can you expound on that a little bit more? Do you think that we'll ever get to the point that they'll buy grain from us again? And do they still have the infrastructure to feed their people inside that country?
Yeah. So it wasn't the grain board itself. It was the Prime Minister, Haider al-Abadi. But so we're meeting there in one of Saddam's old palaces, and obviously there's a lot of issues to discuss with the Prime Minister, the campaign against the Islamic State, where specific operations stand in places like Ramadi and Fallujah and Mosul, the relationship that Iran now has with a lot of the militias in the country. But there were probably about half a dozen senators. So the question I asked was about the grain board and about the problems they've seen, or that we've seen with the way they were conducting their bids, and why, you know, rice that was more affordable and higher quality was not being bought by Iraq. And that's when we heard that there would be news coming that would probably please not just me but all of you. And that was, you know, the minister that had been charged with the corruption. And again, this is not something that's unique to Iraq. It happens all around the world. Again, what we call corruption, most of the world calls life. That doesn't make it right, but it means that we have to make an effort in our diplomacy, in our trade negotiations, in our security relationships to use every tool of leverage and power the United States has to try to minimize that corruption, to try to get a fair deal for American farmers and ranchers and manufacturers and so forth, and also help stabilize those countries. Because if you look around the world at countries like Ukraine, they've got real security challenges, say Russia, still occupying their territory, but politically and domestically, corruption is a real challenge to the legitimacy of the elected governments in certain countries. You see the same thing in Iraq, you see the same thing all around the world. So corruption is a problem not just in our trade relationships with other countries that we have to address, but also in our broader security and diplomatic relations as well, and to include the stability of those countries, which means the stability of their regions in the world.
Senator Cotton, just your thoughts
On Cuba? So most of you in this audience probably know that I oppose the president's normalization of relations with Cuba. I don't think that we should have changed 50 years of bipartisan policy in return for nothing. In some ways, the Cuba deal was even more one-sided than the Iran nuclear deal. Less consequential, to be sure, because Iran or Cuba is not Iran. You know, they're not on the pathway to nuclear weapons, and they're not involved in multiple hot wars throughout the Middle East. But the Iran deal did include some concessions on Iran's side in return for many more concessions on our side. The Cuba deal didn't include that really at all. I mean, there's still a cop killer of an American cop who's being harbored in Cuba. The dissidents who are being held not only have not been released, or they've been rearrested, many more have been arrested since then. Just last week, before the president went to Cuba, Raul Castro imprisoned several dozen more dissidents, which is an abject humiliation to the president and therefore bad for U.S. prestige in the world. And ultimately, while I want to see all of you to be able to sell your goods into Cuba, without a genuine market-based economy in which the government is not intermediating every single transaction, in which consumers can get the benefits of the work that they engage in, that market is not going to grow in a way that we would like to see, that would ultimately be much more beneficial to all of you. So I understand that we have a disagreement. Some people in this room and I have a disagreement. I think we can just agree to disagree and try to move forward from where we are now to help promote a Cuba that is free and prosperous. And if that's the case, the small promise of President Obama's deal will become a much bigger promise of an allied, free, and prosperous Cuba. Randy?
Yes, Senator, we certainly appreciate you being here. We certainly appreciate your vote on the GMO labeling. With the bill that Senator Roberts put before the Senate, and then what we understand about Senator Stabenow's very rash comments and very pointed comments about that it's all our fault, the farmers in our nation, and that if we don't do something about it, she's never going to. And she's dug her heels in, it seems like, that she wants a mandatory GMO labeling bill. What can we do? What can we get before the Senate that you think that might have a possibility of having a resolution to this problem and put us in a lot better light, and being able that we don't send a signal out there to the consumers, you know, enforcing some of the bad science that they've been looking at that says that there is something wrong and we have to label it because there is a problem with GMOs. And I know how you feel, but what is your take on what we can do?
Well, I'll give you, for those of you who aren't like, you know, Randy and are doing this full time, I'll give you a little bit of a peek behind the curtain in the Senate. So a little over a year ago, Mike Pompeo and I were traveling at a security conference, and we were talking about his GMO bill and how we're going to move it forward. And I had planned to introduce it in the Senate, and we were going to work with the Farm Bureau and have a big press conference here in Arkansas and try to kick off the push for it. But some of the advocates had asked me to work to find a Democratic co-sponsor. And as of a month ago, when Senator Roberts introduced his compromise version, I still hadn't found a Democratic co-sponsor. And I talked to a few of my Democratic colleagues, and the answer I got is they knew it needed to pass, and they wanted it to pass. They just didn't want to be responsible for it passing. We almost became that close to being included in the big, massive spending bill at the end of last year. And it would have passed on that spending bill if we had included it, and that's because it would have allowed some of those Democrats who wanted the bill to pass but didn't want to vote for it to tell the anti-GMO advocates that, well, they had to vote for the bill to fund the government, but they were really disappointed that measure was included in it. So the votes are there. The reason why that bill failed, in my opinion, and the reason why I couldn't find a Democratic co-sponsor for a year is because the anti-GMO forces have been scaring the American people about the effects of GMO foods. And the science is simply not there. The science clearly, time and time and time again, has proven that GMOs are safe and healthy, and they do nothing but increase but make yields more abundant and make crops more affordable. Not just here in the United States, but for the people around the world who are desperate to be fed by your products. And that is a message that we have to continue to counter. That GMO products, they're not frankenfood. They're not something that's been engineered in a laboratory. In some ways, it's just an extension of the same kind of cultivation habits that man has been using since we moved off of the nomadic plains and settled down and started growing our own food. And that the science is clear. I don't know of a single public policy question in which the science is clearer than the effects of genetically modified organisms in food. And yet the anti-science left continues to push this narrative. And that's the most important thing that you as advocates can do, that the Farm Bureau as a whole can do, that elected officials like I can do, is to reassure the American people who don't live this, who don't come to this summit, who are out there working hard right now in their own fields or working hard in the factory and see maybe a snippet on the evening news, and maybe they're worried about their kids' safety, to try to get home the message that they don't have to be worried about their kids' safety. What they should be worried about is not being able to pay their mortgage or pay their car loan or pay the mortgage on the farm because their grocery bill just went up $700 a year.
Good morning. I have a question about Cuba. Do you have a sense of what the transition of government, if that's what you want to call it, would be there after Raul Castro? And second question, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Could you describe that for us in your mind? What you think it might be, and is it good or bad for us? Thank you.
So on Cuba, I mean, there's various assessments, both public and classified, that I've seen about what will happen post-Castro brothers. I don't think anybody really knows, though, because Cuba is such an insular society, and it's still a communist police state. So I think it's hard to predict what the transition will be. I hope the Cuban people will be able to throw off the yoke of that dictatorship and have a representative government that actually looks after their interests, that provides them a decent life with a livelihood, that they can actually start buying your products, and that market of 11 million people will have its purchasing power grow rapidly. But I don't think anybody can really assess what will happen. And I don't think until that time comes, the promise of that market is going to be what it's sold by President Obama's policy. Trans-Pacific Partnership, can I say what it is? It's very, very long, 5,000 pages, I think. Very complicated. A lot of trade across borders these days is not simply about lowering tariffs or quotas, if there is that. Oftentimes it's about regulatory systems and how to harmonize those and so forth. I'm still reviewing the TPP. I haven't reached a firm conclusion on it. I want it to work for not just Arkansas's farmers and ranchers, but all of the other industries in Arkansas that depend on exporting their products, like our aviation industry. On balance, it looks like a lot of our farmers and ranchers are going to benefit from it, particularly some of our livestock producers. I can't say that about everyone. You know, the rice farmers, once again, didn't get everything that they might have hoped for in that deal in terms of opening Asian markets, as well as our relationship with Mexico and the role that Vietnam might play there. Some of our other industries, like aviation, it does look like they're going to benefit from it. But it is a very large, very complex deal. I don't think that we should say any of these deals on principle are right or wrong. What we should say is it a good deal? Is it going to benefit American and Arkansas's producers in your role as a farmer or a rancher or a factory worker? And is it going to benefit us as consumers when we go to Walmart or JCPenney to buy our clothes and to buy our food and to buy our housewares and so forth? That's going to be a long process, and that vote probably won't occur at least until after the election, if it occurs at all this year. But that's the way I will approach it. The way I approach pretty much any piece of legislation is the balance of good in it outweigh the balance of bad. Anytime you've got 5,000 pages, it's not going to be a perfect piece of legislation or a perfect trade deal.
Senator, I've got a question. I'm a farmer here in Arkansas, and regulation is killing me, along with low commodity prices. You know, it all depends on the election, I'm sure, but we need some help on these regulations. They're really stifling us, and we cannot do anything anymore. So, what's your ideas, and if where the elections happen this fall, just give your opinion on that. What you think?
Yes. So I think the scope and the power of the regulatory state is one of the great issues of our time. There's almost nothing that you do over the course of your day, from getting up to turn on your sink to brush your teeth to going to sleep on your mattress at night, that is not regulated in some way by a government agency. Oftentimes under guidance from elected officials that is extremely vague and open-ended, that has passed serious public policy choices from the people who are responsible for them to people who are unaccountable for them, you know, federal regulators. So how can we address that? Well, we can do it here and there on a one-off basis by using the most powerful tool that we have in the Congress, our spending power. That's one reason why we, Senate Republicans, are going to try to move forward with spending bills as soon as we get back from this Easter recess. It will be the earliest that the Senate has done so in probably a generation. Because when you have a single $1 trillion, 2,000-page bill, you're turning over most of your power and leverage to the executive branch. When you have individual, discrete bills funding specific agencies and departments that are done months before the deadline for the government funding, you have much more power to say, no, you can't implement this regulation. You can't spend money on that regulation. However, that's more like a continuance. It's not as good as an acquittal because it doesn't last as long. What we can do is try to change the way the rules play out in advance to stop these regulations before they get implemented. So one thing, for instance, you can take all the environmental laws, many of which were passed in the 70s, that govern the EPA's conduct, which have had vast and great gains in the quality of our air, the quality of our water, and so forth, and say that we've done great good for our society, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and so forth. But we granted too much authority to the EPA, authority that was used appropriately at a time but is now being abused. Revisit those laws, provide more specific guidance that limits the discretion of unelected federal regulators and puts the responsibility back on us so you can evaluate the choices we've made. We can do that on a agency by agency, law by law basis. A second, more sweeping solution that I also support is requiring federal or congressional approval for all kinds of regulations after a certain threshold. So say if a law has a certain level of economic impact in our society, it simply can't go into effect until Congress ratifies it. The EPA wants to issue a new regulation. The Fish and Wildlife wants to designate a new species. The National Labor Relations Board wants to change union organizing rules. If it has a certain level of economic impact in our society, it has to come to Congress for a simple up or down vote. That's the way Congress organized the base closing process about 30 years ago. Created an independent commission to recommend which bases should be closed, but then Congress had to vote for that, yes or no. That would allow all of you and every other Arkansan to evaluate what Senator Bozeman and I and our 4 congressmen have done, just like the other 49 states could evaluate their representatives. And it would keep the elected officials from pointing to the EPA or pointing to the National Labor Relations Board and just always complaining about them. because that's part of the problem. It's not just unaccountable regulators, it's politicians who want to dodge responsibility. That's who gave their power away to those regulators in the first place, so they could avoid the responsibility for the actions that these regulators are taking. That's not the right way to govern in our society. The people that you elect and send to Washington should be accountable to you, and they should be accountable for the very consequential decisions that these agencies make. So those are just 3 ways that I would go about both minimizing some of the immediate harm of specific regulations, but also changing the way that we regulate to make it smarter and, as important, more accountable to the people. Thank you all.